Hello, everybody in UK Crime Book Land. I'm just about to talk to Liz Freemantle about her latest book, The Honey and the Sting. And Liz is going to open by reading a section of the book today to let you have an idea of where the plot is going to go and entice you to hopefully buy it after.
Okay, well, thank you, Alex. Thanks for having me. And yeah, so The Honey and the Sting, it's a kind of gothic revenge thriller. And I'm going to dive right in and give you a little excerpt so you can get a feeling of the tone of the book. And in this excerpt, we've got Felton, who has gone to visit the Duke of Buckingham, he's the most powerful man in England. It's 1628, Charles I on the throne, and the Duke of Buckingham is, some say, more powerful than the king, and he's going to commission Felton to do something for him, and you will find out what it is. Okay, so George pauses. Deal with the mother and her sister. Get rid of the letters and bring the boy to me. Then you shall have your captaincy. Deal with. Felton feels as if he has swallowed a shard of glass. Make it seem accidental. I can't do that. They're women. Now the facade cracks open, revealing the full extent of George's fear. Those women could send me to the block. His expression is haunted. Me, your George. Felton tries to tame the confusion of emotion roiling within him. I don't think I can. George interjects. You've seen the threat to me, in black and white. Can't you have them imprisoned? If only it was so easy. Those two hussies will cast aspersions, and I can't risk people asking questions, or those forged letters falling into the wrong hands. God knows what might. His desperation is clear. There's no other way. They must be silenced. George hooks his arm around Felton's waist, pulling him close. Remember how we were? Life was so simple then. I miss those days. Their foreheads touch. George takes Felton's hand, turning it upward to expose the ugly, jagged scar at the base of his thumb, opening his hand too to reveal his own neat silver scar, pressing them together. Blood brothers. Our secret. Remember? Of course I remember. It's not as if you haven't taken a life before. George's tone has sharpened. On the battlefield, it is different. You know what I mean. I protected you when you needed it. You can't have forgotten that. The past comes crashing back. The young man Felton killed in France, those dead eyes staring out. It had started as a fight over a game of dice, but his adversary was smaller, younger, and something had come over Felton, a streak of cold violence. He had knocked the boy to the ground and booted him over and over until his head was caved in. It wasn't anger or any common reaction, but a perverse desire to know if he was capable of taking a life. He was. Had George not sworn they were together elsewhere, he would have hanged for it. It turned out the boy was the magistrate's son. They are silent for several moments while Felton's thoughts percolate. It's them or me. Just because they belong to the fairer sex doesn't make them immune from treachery. George's eyes are vast and dewy, and for a moment, Felton thinks he is on the brink of tears. I did, George. I do. Of course I do. An image asserts itself in his head of George crouching over the block, his hair falling forward. The sound of the axe thuds in his ears. You know me, says George, better than anyone. Felton remembers vividly the George he knew, the loyal young man who risks himself to protect his friend, and he is back in that idyllic summer with George and Bridget before they parted the ways. It was the happiest time of his life. I do know you. He might balk at the task, but he is a soldier. He knows death, and he knows killing.
That was a excellent chapter, which gives us a introduction to Felton. In the story, you split it into multiple narratives. Why did you do that, and what were the challenges in doing it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I nearly always write from 2 or 3 different perspectives, because I find it allows me to kind of open the story up so that I can use situations where the reader knows what's going on, but they can see that the characters don't have a full picture of what's happening. And I quite like, I've got 3 voices. So there is Felton, and there are 3 sisters in the story, and 2 of them tell their parts in the story. So it allows me to take the action out into different places, so the reader can see certain actions that are happening elsewhere that are going to impact on the main story. And I like writing like that. It's expansive.
It allowed for great tension points, and allowed for a few twists. What made you decide that to twist on a real character like Buckingham?
Yeah, I mean, all my other books have been based on exclusively on real characters, and I've had the odd kind of subsidiary fictional character in them. And this book was intended to be not about the 3 sisters, but about another woman who was Buckingham's sister-in-law. She'd been married off to his, she was Francis Cook. She'd been married off to his brother, who was mad enough to have had to be shut away because he was a danger to himself and society. And Buckingham had negotiated with her father to marry her to him so she was an heiress, so he could get his hands on her titles and get them into the Villiers family. And I really tried to make this story work, but all the timings were wrong. So in the end, I had to abandon that idea. But I stuck with, so Felton is a real character from history, though most of the story I gave him is not true. But what he does in the end is the actual story. So in a sense, the twist is the truth. And, but it's not, I suppose it's not a novel that is dependent on one of those twists you never saw coming, that kind of like, oh my God, I never realized that was, that I look at it as a kind of slow unwinding of the story. It sort of unspools, and things happen that either surprise the reader or they surprise the characters. But I didn't want to rely on any kind of unreliable narrators. Yeah.
When you were splitting it and writing it, it must have been really difficult to decide when to split it into each section. How did you do that?
With great difficulty. And I ended up, I usually try and I do a vague map, and then I try and kind of write my way into the story, whereas I got really lost and got really, really confused. So I ended up on about a 4th draft, having to do a whole spreadsheet, color coordinated, with all the time, the weather, what was happening politically at the time in each section, and then work out who was going to tell which bit of it. It was really overly complicated, but hopefully it's turned out so all that complication has gone and it's just a real smooth story, because it has to kind of pass from one to the other like a relay. Yeah, it wasn't easy, but I think I did it in the end.
I think you did anyway. Yeah, I enjoyed it, and that's one of the reasons why I think the title is a really unique title. Could you tell us how you come up with it?
Yes. Well, it was a quote that was from some advice that Francis Bacon, the philosopher, had written a letter of advice to the Duke of Buckingham about how best to apply his power to get what he wanted. And the analogy he used was use the honey and the sting. You need the honey and the sting to get what you want. So be sweet and sharp. And I just thought, I mean, it was when I found that quote, that was the inspiration for the whole novel, really. I thought it was such an extraordinary idea, and such an extraordinary idea for a thriller, this idea. And I think it's a theme that runs right through all the characters. There's an element in all the characters of both that sweetness and that sharpness. Even Felton, who's basically a hired killer, you know, there's some humanity in him too.
Yeah. For people that haven't read you before, you've switched kind of genre methods. Why did you switch to historical crime?
So I wrote 4 novels that were under the name Elizabeth Freemantle rather than E.C. Freemantle. And they are all set in Tudor and Elizabethan period. And they're all focused around particular women who had an impact on the kind of fulcrum of power at the time. So they're kind of women at the heart of the court, where everything happens. They're influential. They're figures from history, and there are elements of thrillers in the books. It begins with the last wife of Henry VIII, Queen's Gambit is the novel, and Catherine Parr. She's an extraordinary woman, and in some senses, it's a kind of political thriller. She has to negotiate her way out of a plot on her life. And so there are elements of thriller, but those 4 books are all, you know, there's a lot of jeopardy and a lot of danger, but they're all kind of more straightforward historical novels about particular figures. Whereas I knew I wanted to write my previous novel to this, called The Poison Bed. I really desperately wanted to write this story of a Jacobean murder. It was a poisoning that happened at the court of James I, that his absolute favourite, one of the Duke of Buckingham's predecessor, really, as royal favourite, and his wife were arrested for this murder. So it was a political murder. And the only way I thought I could write that was as a proper thriller with a big twist, with all the kind of build up. And that was the only way I could see to write it. And it in my head, it was just it had a different tone. It was faster paced. And so I discussed it with my publishers, and they said, well, you know, let's kind of brand you slightly differently for it, and we'll make it, you know, you'll be E.C. Freemantle, so that readers will understand that it's a slightly different approach and more of a thriller. And so that's kind of how that came about. And then The Honey and the Sting, I had always intended to do a kind of companion piece to that. And I'd been very influenced by all those very dark Jacobean tragedies where, you know, women are the kind of agents of moral collapse. And so I wanted to write a book where, you know, the Honey and the Sting is very much, there are 2 voices in it, and there's the husband and the wife, and she seems to be that agent of moral collapse. And then I wanted to write another novel that explored that, but from a different perspective, really. So The Honey and the Sting is much more of a revenge plot. And so, yeah, they're different in tone, but in a sense, they've all got elements of each other. You know, the voices are quite distinctively mine, I think.
What made you choose that period in history?
Well, I had become really interested when I studied English and rather than history at university, and I'd become really interested in, during the Reformation, everything was turned on its head. I mean, you know, we kind of think of, you know, Henry VIII like a kind of Bluebeard figure, and, you know, he's killing off his wife so he can get an heir, and he changes the religion so he can marry another wife. But it's that to a large extent, but it changed everything. The whole culture was turned on its head when Catholicism went. And it's a really interesting period in history in terms of the new voices that emerge at that time. So out of that sprung Shakespeare, all those incredible Elizabethan poets and playwrights, and also women's voices. So women were starting to write, and that's what really interested me. And actually, Catherine Parr was an author. She was a best-selling author. She wrote 2 books. They're religious books, but if they're religious in that time, they're political. So she was kind of towing a dangerous line, actually, because she nearly lost her life as a result of her political stance. And the jeopardy in that period fascinated me, and also the idea that life was cheap. You know, people were executed. That, you know, the stakes are really, really high in that period, and there are some unbelievably exciting true stories. So I wanted to tap into all that, and I haven't stopped tapping into it. I've just kind of gone forward in time. So I've reached the Stuart period now, but there are still so many stories to tell.
Are you intending on sticking with that, or following the narrative within that section of history, or are you thinking about moving further forward or back?
Well, interestingly, my new book is a bit of a departure, the one I'm writing at the moment. It's set in Rome in 1610. So we're in a similar period, but it's a completely different culture. It's about a female painter who was a real figure. And it's another, I mean, it's thrillery, but it's a different kind of story. It's about a father's extreme jealousy of his daughter because they're both painters and she's a better painter, more successful than him. And so his actions as a result of that, and the fact that she's female in a time when women weren't really, you know, it was hard to be a woman and a painter. And so it's a real departure for me. It's set in Rome, and I've actually never been to Rome. I was meant to go there on a research trip in the spring, but obviously I couldn't go. So I just had to start writing it. And you know, thank heavens for the internet.
So what has it been like trying to reach research?
I can't hear you.
What has it been like trying to research on the internet instead of?
I can't hear you, Alex. I can't hear you.
I think we've dropped out for some reason. If you can get Sam to write the questions in the thing, if you ask Sam whether she can hear me, I don't know. I might have to drop out. And
I can't hear you. I can't hear.
I don't know whether if I drop back in. Yeah.
I can't.
I don't know whether she can see.
The sound's completely gone for me.
If we can get Sam to drop.
I'm trying.
Drop her out and back here, because I don't know how to help her out from my end. Yeah, I can't really.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to answer Sam's question. She's asked me about my titles and covers. She says they're very distinctive, and do I have a say in them? The titles are nearly always mine, but sometimes I have a title that's not really, my editor doesn't like my title. So I will have to kind of come to a compromise. But actually, both The Poison Bed and The Honey and the Sting are absolutely my titles. But the covers, I don't have a say in them at all. I mean, I guess if I really didn't like it, I could veto it. But I wouldn't really do that because my publishers know how to sell the books, and they do really fabulous covers for me. Yeah, so I hope you can all hear, because I can't hear anything. So I don't know what's happened to the sound. So I've got another question here from a Facebook user saying, when I research history, do I ever get upset at what I discover? Yeah, sometimes there are some really shocking stories. And I think I'm always upset when young women are victimized or people are treated unjustly. And some terribly shocking things happen. But I think my way of understanding that is by writing these novels. Yeah. I'm wondering if I should reload or something so I can get the sound back.
I heard you saying about book covers from Sam's question. If there's a few questions that have dropped in while we've been waiting, can you see them on the side?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Okay. So Samantha that's Sam again. Becoming a novelist was my childhood dream and what inspired me. I just never really wanted to do anything else, but it took me a long time to achieve. I was in my children were grown up basically by the time I managed to get a novel published, and I've written lots that never got published. So yeah, I don't know what inspired me. I think because I was a bookworm as a kid, and books were my refuge. So I wanted to kind of recreate that space in a way to tell the stories myself. Yeah, that's what drove me.
In the recreation of that, what made you decide to go for the perspective you did in your novels?
Oh,
have a theme.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm always focused around women's stories and the kind of women's stories that haven't really been told, and so I think that's really my main theme. I'm always interested in that, and I suppose in a way that's why my work, I've ended up writing historical fiction, because I've kind of gone back into why it is that women have struggled to make themselves heard. And so that's always a theme, is about women finding their voice.
One of the characters in Honey and Sting, Melissa, is very unique. Where did you come up with the character for her?
Well, I'm always interested in having characters who are in some ways diverse, and I never want, one has this idea of, if you read a lot of historical fiction or history books, it's all about the people, the privileged people, and I'm kind of interested in people who were there, whose stories would never have been told. And I felt like Melissa, I was interested in these ideas about women and madness, and she would have been just classed as mad in her time, some kind of a lunatic. She has visions. She's not like other people, but she's got a very, very distinct personality, and she's very intelligent. And so I thought of her as that she was someone who suffered from schizophrenia. And this was where her visions came from. So nowadays, she would have been classed as schizophrenic. In those days, of course, there was no term for anything like that. She would have just been labelled as mad. And so that's really where I got the idea for her from. But also, there was a woman called Eleanor Davis who was a prophetess in that period. And she prophesied the assassination of the Duke of Buckingham. And kind of, so I wanted to riff on that. And I thought, well, you know, how, in what sense would she be a prophet? What sense would she believe she can see into the future? And I wanted to kind of explore those ideas about, is she seeing into the future, or is she kind of creating a situation in which the future that she envisages occurs because she puts the idea into people's minds? So I wanted to play on that a bit with her. Yeah.
It was essential to have, as you say, the multiple narratives and support characters. The role of her little nephew was key to the book. What was it like writing the part of his mum for that?
The mother and son. Well, because, you know, that I suppose in some ways Hester is the character who's closest to me, because I'm a mother and I know, you know, the idea of, you know, one of the kind of themes of novel is what lengths will a mother go to protect her child? And, you know, the answer is she'll go pretty far. And so Hester's the one who, I mean, they all the main narrators go on a particular journey and they kind of change their viewpoint about things, but particularly Hester, because she's forced into a really impossible situation. And yeah, the child, I mean, in some ways, her child started out more as a kind of cipher to drive the novel, that her protecting the child, you know, that the child's in danger and they have to go into hiding to protect him, was the kind of beginning. It's the beginning of the story. And so he was just a kind of little boy in the background. But as I wrote, and as I wrote different drafts, he really took on a strong character of his own. And, you know, without giving anything away, he is really, really important to the whole kind of tying up of the story in the end.
The role of the multiple characters is key. Who would you say would inspire you to do that in the people you might have read?
Oh, well, gosh, that's a good point. I mean, I'm really very influenced by Sarah Waters, and she wrote a book, Fingersmith, that is just, I think it's the perfect historical crime novel. What she, you know, she tells, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with it. And if not, read it. It's fantastic. She writes the story from two very distinct, different perspectives, and you know, she flips between one and the other halfway through the novel, actually. So it's not really like this way where you kind of run through like a relay between the voices. And I'm very influenced by her as a writer. I think she really understands pace. She really understands how to convey jeopardy and excitement and page-turning thrills. So she's particularly one. But I don't know, other novelists like Gillian Flynn, my contemporary crime novelists who do that. And I think she did that particularly well in Gone Girl by flipping between the two voices. I think it just allows a kind of expansiveness, and it lets the reader feel they have a view on particular private worlds of these different characters. They feel like they've got a better grip on the story, and then maybe they haven't, and they might understand things that are coming up for characters in the book that the characters don't know about, which creates excitement and tension, which is what writing's all about. Even writing that's not crime writing or thriller writing, there has to be a certain tension and a certain revelation that keeps the reader interested. Otherwise, what's the point?
Yeah, it worked really well on audio. How did you immerse yourself into the universe and be able to describe the period?
And that's interesting. I don't really know, because obviously I've not been to 16th century, 17th century England. I do a lot of research, a lot of reading. I visit a lot of places, buildings. I think architecture is often a real influence on me, where I can put myself in a space to understand how people lived. So museums, artifacts, letters, writings of the period, and somehow you build up an idea of what it was like. But if I went back there, I'd see it's completely different. I'm getting it completely wrong. There's no way that I can get it completely right. But I think the thing that my role as a writer of fiction is to create a world that is completely believable and bulletproof, so the reader feels confident that they know where they are. And I think there's a certain amount of scene setting that has to happen. And I think I have quite a cinematic eye for, I'm a real film buff. So I often imagine a scene as a kind of scene from a film. So I'll describe it, and then I'll put the characters in there, and they will begin to talk, and they'll create that something will happen because the characters are in there. But I might start with some description of the scene. So they're really rooted in a place that's unfamiliar, but I have to make it solid. I have to make it come to life.
One of the scariest things about it was the priest hole. Have you ever been in one in like a museum or anywhere?
I never have, and I am really, really claustrophobic. So for me, that I hardly had to imagine it. I kind of already knew what that was like. I'm so claustrophobic. I can't go on an aeroplane. I can't. There's much I can't do. So I really had an idea of what that would be like, but the idea of actually going inside one, I don't think I could. So it was very easy for me to create the fear around. It's really oppressive. The whole idea is really grim for me.
I think the hardest thing for me would be getting stuck in it and not being able to get out. It definitely came across when in the book. Yeah.
I wanted that real sense of kind of horror in a way. It's almost as if the house is a character in the book, and that priest hole is a mouth that swallows them up. In that sense, the house is kind of monstrous.
Yeah. If the house is a character in the book, were you influenced in any way by it, like horror, and like trying to write those bits?
I mean, it's funny. I don't really read horror because I always think I'm a bit sensitive for it, and I don't really watch horror films either, because as a child I used to stay up really late, and I wasn't supposed to, and watch Hammer House of horror films. If I watch them now, they're ridiculous, kind of black and white Dracula things, and they terrified the life out of me. And so I always thought, I can't watch a horror film because I'll be so terrified. But in fact, I recently did watch, because I'm a huge fan of an actress called Florence Pugh, and I watched a film called Midsummer. because I really wanted to watch her. And it's a really nasty horror film.
It is rather gruesome, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's gruesome, but it's fantastic. I was completely wrapped up in it. I thought it was a fantastic movie. And so in a sense, I mean, though that's not set inside a house in that same way that's really claustrophobic, it is set in that community, which is really claustrophobic. And I think the whole idea of a horror film is you're in a place, it's a group of people in a place where they can't get out. And so that's very much what I tried to create in the book. And so I suppose in some ways I did have Midsummer in my mind, and that the way she was sort of inveigled into that situation, it was really, really creepy, and had echoes of the period actually that I'm writing in. Those strange rituals and things. There was a little bit of that. Yeah.
Is there anything about that kind of ritual thing that particularly appealed to you in trying to scare people? Because I like the little twists and things and all the stuff that you put in with the changing of perspectives. You were able to put stuff in, and you didn't know who had done things.
Yeah, well, I suppose because of the period, and the fact that these women they're three sisters who live on their own with a child, and so they're always regarded as they're regarded with suspicion by society, because and there's always that sense in the background of the book that I hoped comes through, is that they could always be denounced as witches because they're not married, they're different, they live alone, and then that becomes, it's almost like they take this journey deeper and deeper into the countryside, and they find themselves in a place where there's more kind of folklore, and Margie, who's the daughter of the housekeeper of the house they find themselves in, she believes in really strange things, and they have to kind of absorb all these strange beliefs, and they get kind of wrapped up in it because they're stuck in this place. So yeah, I kind of enjoyed writing that, because it is quite threatening in terms of atmosphere, and everything in that house is sharp, or you don't understand. It seems like the house is hiding things and behaving strangely. It has a kind of you don't know what's really happening. And even the reader doesn't understand what's going on in the house a lot of the time.
What made you decide to go on a journey, a kind of revenge novel over other things that you could have chosen?
Well, I think I wanted to write a revenge novel because I'd been so inspired by Jacobean revenge thriller, the revenge dramas, where they're really bloody, and they're really there's something very visceral about them. So there had always been that sense I wanted to write it's a kind of almost a psychological thriller, The Poison Bed, and I also wanted to write a revenge thriller. I wanted to kind of set myself that task to see if I could do it, really, because they're different kinds of thrillers, and I'm interested in the idea of revenge, because we all kind of wish, there are moments in our lives we wish we could take revenge on some slight, we think, oh, I wish I could have done that or got my own back, or in very little ways. But so it's something that we all understand in some small way, that idea of wanting to have someone who's slighted us, to have them, karma, basically, to see karma at work. We, in some ways, that's satisfying, the idea that can happen. And so I kind of wanted to look at that, but from a much, much darker perspective, where the revenge is much greater and the stakes are much higher.
Revenge novels are very cinematic who, if you were to choose it for a film, who would you have play the main roles?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, as I said, I'm a real fan of Florence Pugh. I'd love her to be. She'd probably have to be Hester because she's probably the right age. I mean, they're very young, the girls, so they, particularly Hope. Hope is 16, so I don't know, some amazing mixed race 16-year-old who's who can play it's quite a tricky role, Hope, as well, because she's so innocent and she gets everybody into so much trouble with her innocence. And the men, oh, I don't know, I'd love to see someone like, oh, I don't know, the Duke of Buckingham, someone very, very, he'd have to be someone incredibly glamorous, and maybe Michael Fassbender or someone like that.
Cool.
Yeah, it would be cool. It would be cool. Although it's a tiny role because he's not really in it very much. He's in it at the beginning and at the end. Felton's really the big role for a man.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know who'd be Felton. Maybe Michael Fassbender would be Felton. He's a real villain.
Yeah. What is the thing that attracts you about writing villains?
Well, I don't know. Bad people are much more interesting to write than good people. And so in some ways, I mean, the women in my book, they're good people, but they're forced to confront their own particular moral structures. And that's when they become interesting. And I think in some ways, everyone's got that part of themselves, however suppressed it might be, where you wonder what you're capable of we all want to behave in a moral way. And there are some people where the amorality, the immorality, the wickedness leaks through their kind of, it's like a diaphragm, a kind of, that it's leaky in some people and they are really evil. And I think it's interesting. It's interesting to explore because they are not like us, because we are able to not be like that. We're able to, suppress that kind of whatever it is, that animal part of ourselves, that vengeful, vindictive, horrible part of ourselves. We're able to keep it in control. And I think it's interesting because it's different from most of us.
The morality of that period is so different to what we see today. What do you think was important about exploring the differences?
Well, I think it is really different, and it's, they're almost everything about their culture would be unacceptable now. Just the power structures, and obviously I'm very interested in the position of women and how they had no agency at all. And I'm interested in that as an idea in general with people who, how they find a way to make themselves heard, to make their lives count. And, in that time, ordinary people, their lives didn't count really. And it's so deeply shocking that, that things like rape in marriage, there was no such thing. Men could rape their wives. It was perfectly acceptable. It was normal. As well as, they could beat their servants. So anyone that didn't have any power was basically, they underwent abuse constantly. And I think it's really interesting to explore how people deal with that, yet retain their humanity. And, I find that's extraordinary. Those people are extraordinary, the ordinary people that put up with that. And sometimes they don't.
Yeah, I think that's how I managed to relate to it, because with studying history, I was aware of the the fact that men were legally allowed to beat their wives with a short stick and weird little quirks like that, which wouldn't be allowed today. What made you decide to avoid exploring those and just focus on the psychological side of it?
I think to some extent I explored those ideas more in my other earlier novels. So I felt that in some ways it's always there in the back of the story. But I suppose in this book particularly, it's almost like a fantasy, because I really give these women an opportunity to fight back when they wouldn't have had that opportunity. So in some senses, and I think I write that in my author's note, it's almost a fantasy novel, because the likelihood of women who are such ordinary women, they wouldn't have had the wherewithal. They would have been completely suppressed. And so I kind of wanted to do that for them as a kind of recompense. That's what you can do. You can do it with fiction. You know, if I was just writing straight history, I wouldn't be able to do that. I wanted them to fight back.
What other fighting back periods do you think you might use in the future?
I don't know. I mean, I'm quite keen to write some contemporary novels, but I don't know. At the moment, I'm working on this one set in Rome, and it is a kind of fight back novel. She's quite an extraordinary character, my protagonist. And other periods, I'm always interested in those periods where everything's changing. So the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, everything changes very fast. And, you know, you've got technical advancements, and you've got attitudes changing, breaking away from the Victorian period into the modern era. And so times like that are really interesting. I don't know. I mean, when I find a period I want to write about, I'm usually driven by a character or a story from that period that inspires me, rather than thinking I want to write something about this period and I'm going to find, you know, so I usually find a character first. And I think, oh, that sounds like one of my people. And then I'll set something around them.
In your other books, you wrote a trilogy. What's it like writing a trilogy versus a standalone?
Well, actually, I mean, it's called a trilogy, but in some ways it's not a traditional trilogy, because I don't have the same protagonists in each of the books. But what it is it's 3 novels that kind of, they chart the period of, well, there were 50 years of female rule at the end of the 16th century, from when Lady Jane Grey took the throne for a matter of days, and then Mary Tudor, who became known as Bloody Mary, and then Elizabeth, who was on the throne for many, many years. And that was 50 years of female rule in a time when women had no say in anything. I mean, the world was very, very rigidly structured. God at the top, then the king, then all of men, and then all of women, and then animals. And the idea of a female monarch kind of turned everything upside down. And I think that was interesting. And I wanted to use that as a kind of starting point. So all the novels chart that period when Elizabeth, so in the first novel, Queen Elizabeth is a young woman. She's 14, she's a very young woman. And we follow her through the period where she's really persecuted and might lose her life because her sister's on the throne, who is a Catholic and she's a Protestant. until she comes to the throne, and then how she manages to negotiate her political power as a queen in a world where women are not meant to have any power. So I wondered, so I've set my stories against that backdrop, but the trilogy really, in some ways, is her story in the background that I focus on three different stories of people that were very, very close to the throne at that time. And yeah, and so in a sense, they're all standalone. But in fact, all my books, not just those three, they all move forward in time. So each one is set a little bit later than the other in time. So if you read them all in order, you would get a kind of picture of history through its, I mean, how many years? It's about 75 years now up to the Honey and the Sting, which is 1628. Yeah.
Writing over such a long period, such a big block, you must have spotted some patterns and social changes that people wouldn't be aware of. What has the change to crime allowed you to do about exploring those?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I suppose one of the big changes was the kind of attitude to capital punishment. In the Stuart period, fewer people are executed. In the Tudor and Elizabethan period, oh my goodness, everyone, all those courtiers, they'd rise up and then they'd become too powerful, off with the head. That was a pattern that was repeated over and over again. That happens much less frequently as we move into the Stuart period. People are kind of left to fester in prison. Although Sir Walter Raleigh was executed, I'm trying to remember the date actually now, 1613, I think, something like that. But he was a bit of a kind of leftover from that Elizabethan period, where Elizabeth had to get rid of people who threatened her status, because it was so fragile, because she was female. So she got rid of Mary Queen of Scots. She got rid of the Duke of the Howards, the Duke of I can't remember. There were several of them, but she had to get rid of them, otherwise they would threaten her too greatly. So I suppose the change and where it comes, I suppose the jeopardy in my novels was all about, well, are they going to be executed or not? And then as I move into the Stuart period, it's kind of different, and it becomes more about these two really infamous murders, and it's less about whether the perpetrators will be executed, and more about whether they'll get away with it or how it will happen. So I think that marked the move to crime novels. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there any other kind of period kind of writing that you might try and study, like say science in that period, or other things like that?
I mean, the end of the 17th century starts to be really interesting in terms of scientific and technological advances and things. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I am interested in that. And I mean, for example, I love Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I think it's a fantastic novel. It's all about fear of technology. That's something that interests me. And I don't know if I wrote a novel that focuses on that fear of technology, if it would be a historical one or a contemporary one, because there's a lot of technology that's quite frightening now. If we look at artificial intelligence, and it's all here. All those things. Sorry, my dogs are barking. All those things I was afraid of as a child. The idea that robots are going to take over. Well, you only have to Google robots taking over, and there's some pretty alarming stuff. So possibly, I don't know where I'm going to go next, but there's so much territory. I feel like I can pick anything, any of history. I probably wouldn't go back earlier than the Tudor period, because I think you're kind of lost in the mists of time, and it's so different. I don't really understand it. So yeah, maybe something much closer, maybe something set in the 50s. I don't know.
Yeah, so if you were going to go to totally contemporary, where would you want to go in the world that you've not researched or written
That's
about?
a good question. I'd probably write it. I live in London. They say write what you know. I'd probably set it in London, but I think the challenges would be about the technology that we have now and how difficult it would be to keep things from my characters. So I'm writing in 17th century. I don't have a mobile phone that's going to inform anyone of anything. It takes 3 days to get a letter from London to into the country. So that's really, I can really use that. So it would be a new challenge. That's all I can say, to write it now. But I like to set myself challenges. Yeah.
What is the biggest challenge that you think you want to explore? If you think you could have a good go at?
Oh God, I think every book is a huge challenge for me. It's really not easy. And I never want to kind of sit back and think, right, I know the formula. I'm going to write another book that's like the last book I wrote. I always want to write something that is in some way different and maybe I shouldn't do this, but I always want to make it difficult for myself, because I feel like then I'm serving my readers. If I'm doing something different and exciting, and I know sometimes readers want the comfort of knowing where they are, or that it's a series and you're writing about a familiar character, but somehow I don't ever naturally do that. I always want to make it hard for myself. So yeah, each book is more difficult than the last.
And that is a really interesting note to end on. We've reached 8 o'clock, and we've reached the end of the hour. And I've really enjoyed learning all about how your books have come about. Thank you for letting us explore your worlds.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Alex. And I mean, I'm privileged to have been, you've asked me such interesting questions, and it's been really great to meet and to do this.
Thank you so much for